For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Collaborating Efforts to Strengthening Cities, Supporting Human Rights-Based Inclusive Resilience for All. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, your participation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is highly encouraged. The chat box is also available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. We are ready to get started, and I will now pass the floor over to Kavita Naidu. Kavita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louisa. Greetings, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you for joining this session on supporting human rights-based inclusive resilience for all. My name is Kavita Naidu. I'm your moderator for this session today. I'm an international human rights lawyer and I work in feminist climate justice. And with me, I have a distinguished panel, which I will introduce shortly. This session is organized by 3 UN regional offices in Asia and Pacific, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, also known as the Human Rights Office, UN Environment Programme, UNEP, and UN Women. Our session will address 3 questions. The first, how can human rights-based planning support inclusive resilience? What recommendations on the promising innovations and best practices do you have to enable or improve rights-based planning for inclusive resilience? And the third, what implications has COVID-19 had on the inclusion of poor, marginalized, and climate vulnerable groups in climate and disaster planning and processes? The structure of the sessions begins with a keynote address from Mr. Saad Al-Faraghi, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, followed by a presentation from Ms. Camille Pross from the Stockholm Environment Institute to set the scene on the intersections of climate resilience, vulnerability, and human rights. After these presentations, we'll turn to our all-female panel who represent diverse and vulnerable groups such as youth, Indigenous peoples, LGBTIQ+ persons, and persons living with disabilities, whose voices are often unheard in climate action. Before we start, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping rules. As we are a large group today, all attendees will be muted. We ask you to please keep your cameras off, except if you're speaking. We are very eager to engage with all of you and make this an interactive session. My colleague Hermes and Luisa will be your online moderator. We would like to encourage you to please use the chat box for any questions that you may have for the panelists. And with this, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Saad Al-Faraghi, who was appointed in 2017. In 2019, Mr. Al-Faraghi presented the thematic report to the UN Human Rights Council on the explicit link between the right to development and disaster risk reduction and its practical implications. The report also concludes with key recommendations aimed at improving the participatory processes related to the planning, monitoring, and implementation of disaster risk reduction measures and policies. He is now in the process of drafting the thematic report on climate change related policies and projects from a right to development perspective. Mr. Saad, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Distinguished moderator, distinguished speakers and panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be with you today in my capacity as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. I'm happy to participate today in this discussion devoted to achieving human rights-based inclusive resilience for all. I am delighted and inspired that this forum will be looking at climate action and disaster risk reduction from human rights angle. Way too often, the human rights perspective is omitted in such discussions. It is my belief that unless issues such as human rights protection and empowerment of local communities are not addressed, the efficiency and effectiveness of efforts to reduce or manage disaster risk and climate change will be diminished. Further, human rights-based approach to resilience has the potential to link sustainable development goals to human rights standards and to fulfill the promise made in the 2030 agenda, not to leave further behind groups that have already been marginalized. Climate change is a global human rights threat multiplier, which already impacts and will increasingly affect directly and indirectly a wide range of internationally guaranteed human rights, including in particular all people's enjoyment of their right to development. We live in a world confronted with ever-increasing global challenges and crises that pose a threat to the economic, social, cultural, and political development of the current and future generations. A natural or human-made disaster can undo years of development progress in a matter of hours and can stall future development for the next generation. The number of disaster events per year has been increasing since the 1980s and is likely to continue to do so as a result of climate change, population growth, urbanization, an increase in the number of people living in coastal areas and floodplains, and the degradation or loss of natural ecosystems. Data show that developing countries in the global south are disproportionately affected by disasters. The majority of the countries most exposed to natural hazards and climate extreme are located in South Asia and Africa. You can see ample evidence of that. For example, in the World Bank, in the World Risk Report of 2019, the cost is even higher with regard to the loss of life. According to the World Bank, over the past 30 years, more than 2.5 million people have been lost to disasters caused by natural hazards. Between 1995 and 2014, 89% of storm-related fatalities occurred on lower-income countries, even though those countries experienced just 26% of the storms. In the global south, in particular in low and middle-income countries, where the growth of informal settlements is booming and poor families live in hazard-prone areas with deficient or no infrastructure, a lack of social protection and high levels of environmental degradation exist. Many low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa suffer repeated damage from drought and floods. Developing countries in the Middle East and Central Asia are also subject to drought, floods, and earthquakes. And the Asia-Pacific region, which houses 60% of the world population, is highly exposed to natural disasters such as cyclones, earthquakes, tsunami, and volcanic activity, with South Asia and Philippines among the most severely affected. On this background, building resilience in particular for vulnerable countries and populations is of paramount importance. In 2019, I presented to the United Nations General Assembly a thematic report which explored the explicit link between the right to development and disaster risk reduction and its practical implications. Disaster risk reduction is an integral part of social and economic development and is essential if development is to be sustainable for the future. In the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the urgent need to reduce the risk of disaster is recognized and reaffirmed. At the same time, disasters and extreme weather events directly and indirectly affect the enjoyment of a range of human rights, including the right to life, water and sanitation, food, health, housing, self-determination, and culture, as well as the right to development. The right to development is explicitly referred to in paragraph 19C of the guiding principles of Sendai Framework Disaster Risk Reduction. Is therefore closely interlinked with the implementation of the right to development. In my report, I reviewed a number of existing measures in a variety of countries and settings, and I came to the following conclusions. One, in order to integrate the right to development into disaster risk reduction efforts, and more generally ensure human rights compliance, governments should promote channels of participation at all stages of the planning, implementation, evaluation, and monitoring of the related policies and programs on a continuous basis for the relevant stakeholders. Under the Sendai framework, while disaster risk reduction remains a responsibility of the national government, it also requires the active participation, support, and contribution of all relevant stakeholders, such as the government, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, the private sector, and the media. There should be opportunities for the equal participation in all relevant planning and decision-making process of those who are most disadvantaged, including persons with disabilities, women, children, and young people, minorities, indigenous peoples, and members of other disempowered and marginalized groups. Two, national platforms for disaster risk reduction are nationally owned and led multi-stakeholder coordination mechanisms. In my view, national platforms are instrumental in ensuring the integration of the right to development in disaster risk reduction efforts by providing the space for the participation of all relevant parts of the society in the planning, evaluation, monitoring, and implementation of disaster risk reduction plans and programs at the state level. I recommend that states endeavor to create favorable conditions for gender-balanced participation in such platforms and for the inclusion of representatives of marginalized groups. I also recommend that depending on the types of disasters affecting particular countries and their geopolitical structure, similar platforms could be created at the regional or community level. Three, further under the Sendai framework, states are required at a minimum to collect data disaggregated by sex, age, and disability. Data collected in the context of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda targets may and should also be used for the needs of disaster risk reduction planning and policy making, and such data need to be supplemented in accordance with the specific needs of the topic. Data disaggregation efforts need to draw on human rights-based approach to data. States should enhance the international cooperation provided for capacity building activities aimed at improving data collection in developed and developing countries. Civil society's capacity to gather disaggregated data should be enhanced, and innovative approach should be developed to bridge the gaps in data collection. Four, if policies, plans, and programs related to disaster risk reduction and climate action are to be effective, it is of crucial importance that the individuals and communities concerned be well informed of the process for their creation and their outcomes. States should establish mechanisms that provide easy access to information related to disaster risk reduction, development policies, and process, and enact legislation guaranteeing the right to obtain access to information, including information and financing. Legal remedies should be provided to ensure that access to information is not denied. States should provide information in public spaces in relevant language and accessible formats such as image and posters using larger fonts and audio transmission. The gender and diversity dimensions of how and where such information is displayed should be considered. Warning communication technology should be equally accessible to persons of all ages, disabilities, and backgrounds. Information on hazards, vulnerabilities, and risk, and on ways of reducing the impacts thereof should be disseminated to everyone and in formula that are accessible to persons who are deaf or blind or who have a learning disability. States should enhance international cooperation provided for the dissemination of information. 5, in the report, I also make a number of recommendations aiming to ensure the genuine and informed participation of persons with disabilities in disaster risk reduction efforts and measures to ensure gender equitable and universally accessible response, recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction approach to this disaster risk governance. A gender-sensitive approach should be systematically integrated in that evaluation process. Lastly, I also wanted to inform you that this year I will be devoting my thematic reports specifically to the subject of climate change and the human rights from the right to development perspective. In the context of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development, and core international human rights treaties, I'm in the process of collecting information from key stakeholders and experts regarding good practice on the implementation of climate change-oriented policies that are in line with both the right to development and other commitments made under international environmental governance agreements, as well as information about challenges and areas for improvement. On my website, you can find a more detailed call for information. And here, I hope that you and your networks can collaborate with my mandate in conducting this study. I thank you all for your kind attention, and I'm looking forward to the upcoming discussion. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saad, for delivering such a strong keynote address and really highlighting some very important recommendations for so many actors that are working in inclusive resilience and adaptation. To set the scene of the discussion, our next speaker is Ms. Camille Pross. She's a research associate from Stockholm Environment Institute, who will present the latest UN Women Reports SEI conducted under the Empower Project, which is a joint program with UN Women and UN Environment Program, funded by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA. These reports look at gender equality, climate change, and human rights in Asia, and gender responsiveness and disability inclusion in disaster risk reduction in Asia and the Pacific. And I would now like to welcome Camille. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kavita. So hello, everyone. My name is Camille Pross, and I work at SEI, the Stockholm Environment Institute, for the Asia Center, which is based in Bangkok. As Kavita said, I'm a research associate, and I work with the Gender, Environment, and Development cluster. Next slide, please. So at SEI, we do research to influence planning and processes. And when it comes to climate change and disaster, this means that we need to look at who is vulnerable, why they're vulnerable, and how we can address this. My colleagues and I recently published 2 reports with UN Women, and we came to the same conclusion, that institutionalized efforts for inclusive resilience tend to remain superficial because they do not address the root causes of vulnerability. To address this gap, we recommend integrating gender equality and human rights-based approaches, which will not only enable inclusive resilience, but also transformative resilience. Next slide, please. So where does vulnerability come from? In every society, there are identities and status that are more valued than others and lead to privilege, while other factors such as age, education, class, location, and so on, intersect and create social roles, responsibilities, practices, and norms that can lead to discrimination, marginalization, and vulnerability. It's important to understand that these factors intersect and create individual situations and power dynamics that move over time and depend on context. But the most important thing is that all these identities are socially constructed, and the vulnerability that comes from it can then be deconstructed. And while there's an increasing recognition for the need for the interlinkages between gender, human rights, climate change, and disaster risk reduction in international frameworks, on the ground, many initiatives miss the opportunity to really address the root causes of vulnerability because they fail to understand where vulnerability comes from. Next slide, please. So here you have the first report I mentioned before. Countries in Asia and the Pacific committed to inclusive resilience by adopting the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So my colleagues and I conducted a baseline review of how countries in Asia and the Pacific integrated these commitments into the national disaster risk reduction frameworks and action plans. And here are three of the main findings of this study. So the first one is that there is a focus on sex, age, and disability disaggregated data, SAD data. And this has been encouraged by the Sendai framework, but it's also not sufficient to address vulnerability. So indeed, when you look at sex, age, and disability disaggregated data, what you get is who is vulnerable, but you don't really understand how vulnerability intersects or how to address this vulnerability. And this can be attributed to the second point, which is a lack of funding and monitoring mechanism. And because many disaster risk reduction agencies across the region remain underfunded, and they do not have the capacities and the resources to address, to incorporate gender and social inequalities into their work. And similarly, there is a lack of monitoring mechanism, which means that it's almost impossible to monitor progress and what are the gaps remaining to address when it comes to disability inclusion and gender inclusion. Lastly, there is also a cooperation gap between the many stakeholders involved in disaster risk reduction. And this is a bit sad because there are many initiatives going on on the ground, but sometimes these are overlapping and they result in wasted resources. Next slide, please. We did also conduct different case studies to identify promising ways to address the challenges I mentioned. And the example of the Philippines is particularly good to identify how to enable inclusive disaster risk reduction. One of the main enablers is the institutionalization of gender equality and social inclusion in all sectoral ministries of the Philippines. So not only for disaster risk reduction, but also agriculture, education, and so on. Every ministry has to set aside at least 5% of their budget for gender equality. This allows a more holistic approach to tackle vulnerability and also ensures that there are human resources that are trained to work on gender equality. Another strong enabler is the powerful civil society movements that are very active in the Philippines. So this photo is a good example of this, and this event has been organized by UNEP, the Women in Emergency Network. This network came together in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan hit and gathers different organizations working with women on disaster risk reduction and other issues, and together they work to build the capacities for inclusive resilience. The report also focused on disability inclusion, and here we found some important gaps, but we also found some promising practices where local CSOs managed to successfully advocate for the inclusion of people with disability into local disaster risk reduction councils. So this means that these initiatives not only helps to have targeted approaches to help people overcome their vulnerability, but it also empowers them and enables them to reclaim their political power. Next slide, please. And this is the second report we published with UN Women, and it's actually the first time we're presenting it today. So for this one, we assessed the impacts of climate change and gender equality on human rights in Asia. And some of the key findings we have, or actually the main finding from this report, is that climate change affects the most those whose human rights are already not fulfilled. This means that people who already struggle with food insecurity or access to water in their daily life only see their situation worsen with the effects of climate change. We also looked for initiatives that try to tackle climate change, so climate policies, for example, but also led by NGOs and CSOs and so on, and that also try to integrate a human rights-based approach or particular attention to gender equality. But we found that when these approaches are taken separately and not integrated, there are often some major gaps that can even exacerbate vulnerability. So for example, we found initiatives that commit to a human rights-based approach, but they are completely gender blind. And as gender inequality are completely embedded in human rights violation, this means that they not only fail their primary objective of improving human rights, but they also reinforce the vulnerability of women and other gender groups that remain excluded. Next slide, please. And for this report also, we found some promising practices to address the challenges we found. And this is an example from a renewable energy initiative in Bangladesh. In this particular project, rural women got access to electricity, which improved their security, their health, and also gave them many more economic opportunities. But instead of just considering women as beneficiaries of this initiative, the programmers also considered them as powerful agents of change. So the targeted women developed new skills, actively participated in decision-making, and also developed their own women's-led cooperative. So all these factors helped to challenge gender norms at the grassroots level, but also they helped to have transformative change in the community. So indeed, the women involved in this program in the first place were mostly illiterate, but many of the young women in the community got actually inspired by this example and decided to study electrical engineering, which is usually a male-dominated field. Next slide, please. So as I said, the conclusions and recommendations of both reports are quite similar, and this means that the barriers to inclusive resilience are structural. And to move forward and address these gaps, we recommend taking into account the three following points. The first one is to institutionalize intersectional human rights-based approaches. This means that countries need to formulate policies that are sectoral policies that take into account the commitments they made to international frameworks for human rights, gender equality, disaster risk reduction, and climate action. This will enable a holistic approach to tackle vulnerability and also make sure that there are monitoring mechanisms in place to evaluate what remains to be done. The second point is that it is crucial to invest in research to identify the root causes of vulnerability, but also entry points for transformative action. And such transformative actions can only be implemented when there is capacity on the ground to work on this. This means that there needs to be human resources that work on inclusive resilience, but do not just consider human rights and gender equality as an add-on to their normal work. And last but not least, collaboration is key. This means not only collaboration between sectoral ministries within countries, but also with non-state actors such as the private sector, NGOs, CSOs, and community-based organizations. And all these recommendations also are particularly relevant in the context of the current pandemic. And you can move to the next slide, please. And yesterday I came across this quote from the UN Women Executive Director, and I think it resonates with what I just presented, but also sets the scene for the panel that's coming up next. International Women's Day this year comes at a difficult time for the world and for gender equality, but at a perfect moment to fight for transformative action and to salute women and young people for their relentless drive for gender equality and human rights. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention and really look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camille, for your presentation. It was really encouraging to see the examples that you shared of women leading the transformative resilience work in Philippines and Bangladesh. I believe we will be sharing links to this report, so I do encourage our attendees to please pull up those links to learn more about the Empower project. And it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our panel. And if I could just ask the panelists to turn on their videos while I introduce them so that our audience can put a face to the name. Thank you so much. All right, so I'll start with Ms. Sunishma Singh. She is a resilience officer based at the Lami Town Council in Suva, Fiji, working for UN Habitat under the Adaptation Fund project. This young 25-year-old has been engaging effectively with vulnerable communities in local informal settlements. Sunishma has participated in the 2019 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP25, as a youth representative for Fiji. Sunishma has just finished her postgraduate diploma in climate change. Congratulations, Sunishma. The next panelist is Ms. Louise Mabulo. She is the founder of the Cacao Project, an initiative that provides farmers in the Philippines with cacao plant seedlings and teaches them how to responsibly and sustainably produce cacao. The project aids reforestation efforts and has helped with the revival of 2 water sources from increased water retention in soil. For her efforts, Ms. Mabulo was recognized as a Young Champion of the Earth 2019 by UNEP. Congratulations, Louise, it's great to have you. Our third panelist is Ms. Tashiko King. She is a Zenith Kes Torres Strait Island woman with strong connections to Masig Island and Badu Island, and is the community organizer at Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Tish has been actively involved with local grassroots organizing environmental groups across Australia and overseas. Tish brings a diverse perspective of First Nations environmental and social justice. She believes in working towards a sustainable future for First Nations by rebalancing the human-nature interaction central to culture and traditional practices. Very excited to share this panel with Tish, as I'm also based in Australia. So really looking forward to your presentation. The next panelist is Ms. Emily Dwyer. She's the co-director of Edge Effect, a specialist diverse humanitarian and development organization working with SOGS, also known as LGBTIQ+ rights. Edge Effect provides research, training, policy design, CSO strengthening, and other services to ensure that the rights, needs, and strengths of people with diverse SOGS are addressed in humanitarian and development programs. It's great to have you here, Emily. And our final panelist is Ms. Abia Akram, and she leads the South Asia Disability Forum and one of the orgs that co-created and rolled out IASC disability guidelines in humanitarian action. With personal experience of physical disability, Abia Akram has been engaged in the activities of the disability movement since 1997. In the struggle of giving voice to women with disability, she has been lobbying with parliamentarians, UN high-level representatives, focusing on developing advocacy strategies to raise awareness, network, and build capacity at the UN level in relation to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and Inclusive Development. She also coordinates efforts, including persons with disabilities in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goal. And Abia, it's great to see another APWLD feminist on the panel. Welcome. So with this, now that everyone's been introduced to our very female and distinguished panel, we shall now start with our panel discussion. And so the first question to our panelists is, how can human rights-based planning support inclusive resilience? And I'll start first with Sunishma, and you'll have 2 minutes for your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavita. Hello, everyone. So I think human rights-based plannings can support inclusive resilience is when we focus on people with disabilities, children, the elderly, and some women, including heavy pregnant and lactating mothers, should be the core of these interventions. I believe that if we keep the needs of the most marginalized at the heart of all we do, then we can say that we are building the inclusive, resilient communities for all of us. To realize this opportunity, we must prioritize the interests of the most vulnerable and marginalized people, the poorest of the poor, and those people who are most socially excluded. The most marginalized matter too, but that no one should not be denied the opportunity to realize their full potential in contributing to building inclusive and resilient and better communities for everyone. No one should be unfairly burdened by a disaster or a changing climate, and no one should have their interests systematically overlooked. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful words, Sunishma. Thank you so much. Louise, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Definitely. In my case, I think human rights-based planning should be a basic tenet for any approach in reality that reacts to the human situation. It enables decision makers to be held accountable, and the rights bearers, such as youth like me, to claim basic rights to a good future, a clean and healthy environment, and to good food, and to be included in these decisions. But in the case of people here in the communities that I've worked with, we need to restore dignity to the people involved and realize that they are not just victims or beneficiaries or recipients to these climate hazards and talks and policies, but they're actually heard, represented, and have a stake in the trajectory of their own well-being, and enable them to be agents of change and stewards of creation too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. Toshiko.
Hello. Before I begin, I would like to actually acknowledge the country that I am, because it is very cultural for me to do that in my country. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Wurundjeri Wurrung, people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to acknowledge every First Nation person here on this panel as a guest, and for anyone that is viewing. So thank you very much. I guess to really sort of really echo what all my sisters here are saying, and I think it's just really to sort of acknowledge that, you know, these marginalized groups are also, you know, front lines of, you know, the climate crisis, and to really look at, you know, that they don't really contribute to the global, you know, carbon emissions. And so we need to be really using good practices under, you know, these human rights-based approaches, because it is essential to supporting that inclusive resilience. And we do need programs that really identify the realization of human rights as, you know, ultimate goals of development, right? And by, you know, realizing that, you know, we'll be able to have, you know, move forward and have these Indigenous-led, you know, self-determination movements and other fights for social justice. Because at the root cause is a colonial system that puts profits, you know, over big polluters, over land rights, and the well-being of these marginalized communities and the environment are important. And by tackling, you know, all forms of this discrimination and the deeper injustices, we can really shift the status quo. We can shift people's, you know, hearts and minds. And inclusive resilience is fundamental for a just and sustainable future for all human rights-based approaches crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Toshiko. I couldn't agree with you more. Emily, please.
Hi there, and yeah, I'd also like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and recognise that I'm speaking from the land of the Dungurung people of the Kulin Nation. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I think the human rights-based approach is really important for LGBTIQ people or people with diverse SOGIESC, because often we're not recognised at all. So we're not in Agenda 2030, we're not in the SDGs, we're not mentioned in Sendai. But the Human Rights Council in 2011 did recognise that sexual orientation and gender identity are characteristics of rights holders. And so violence and discrimination that we experience are problems that we all need to address. Likewise, sex characteristics were the subject of a statement at the Human Rights Council last year. And I think this is really important because it changes where the burden falls. It's often the role for marginalised people to have to advocate, you know, for their inclusion. And we do this over and over and over again. And it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of resources, and we don't have many of those in the first place. So I think it's really important that taking this rights-based approach means that the obligation falls upon states and the obligation falls upon institutions, including development and humanitarian institutions, to look at themselves, to ask themselves, why is it that we have development programs which are excluding some people, that are excluding marginalized people? Like, why would we do that at all, ever? It amuses me at times to think that we need an inclusion strategy. Why are we excluding people? And so I think we need to think about these norms, about heteronormativity, cisnormativity, the gender binary. If you don't know what those terms mean, learn them. And one way you can do that is by actually looking at a third report, which is published under the Empower Initiative, which is just being, I think will be launched next week or be published in the weeks ahead on SOGS. So I'll leave it there for now, but some passion.
Emily, thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. I find it quite challenging too, understanding why human rights has a selective application. And it's the same with, our climate change policies. There's just not the inclusive language there. So implementation becomes quite a struggle. But looking forward to hearing more. And Abia, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's so good to be here in the strong panel. Like all the women have made very strong interventions. What we see, like from the development perspective and the resilient society, it's important the systematic changes are required, because a huge number of the marginalized group, and especially persons with disabilities, women with disabilities, and the LGBTQI, they all like facing so many discrimination. Still, like 20 years now, we have been fighting for the rights of persons with disabilities, but still they are dying, like especially in during the COVID situation, how we can provide them the systematic changes. We have the references on the Sendai framework on the rights of persons with disability. We have references in the sustainable development goals, but we need strategic interventions where all the key stakeholders can jointly work and can make inclusive and the resilient society where they can enjoy their rights and live a dignified life at least.
Thank you, Abia. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your understanding of what human rights-based planning support, including resilience, looks like, and what you understand the strategies and the gaps are. So we understand that each of you work with your constituency and you represent your communities. Why don't you share with us your personal experiences on the impacts of climate change on the communities that you represent? So again, I'll turn to Sanishma first.
Sorry, thank you. So coming from a tropical region where cyclones pay us visits more than we expect, living in a squatter settlement myself for the last 11 years, I can feel the effects of climate change every single day. Landslides under houses, a rapid increase in water and vector-borne diseases. On an average day, 32 degrees feels like 45. Approximately 20% of Fiji's population lives in informal settlement. These communities are often located in areas highly exposed to climate-related hazards. I've been working with informal settlements straight after graduation. Seeing them lose their house to the effects of climate change is just sad. The wooden stills of the houses are rotting away. The foundation of the houses is getting weak day by day. King tide occurs on a monthly basis, and this is when the settlement is, some of the settlements are 6 feet underwater. School children either doing piggyback on their parents and crossing a knee-level water to attend school. Cyclone Winston was the deadliest storm to affect the nation of Fiji in the year 2016. People are still recovering from it, and within a span of less than a month, Fiji experienced 2 Category 5 cyclones, TC Asa and TC Ana. Both cyclones caused widespread damage to property and livelihoods, and this will take another 5 to 10 years for people to get back on their feet and retrieve what they had lost. Fiji and other Pacific Island countries contribute so much less towards global warming, yet we suffer the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanishma. I completely understand. I also come from Fiji, and as far as I understand, the cyclone season isn't even over yet, and we've already had 2. So this really brings into perspective the kind of challenges that the Pacific Islands are facing. Louise, if you could tell us about Philippines.
Definitely. My work puts me on the front lines of our climate crisis. I work with communities who are not only reliant on soils, air, our sunlight, and our wind, but are also taking the brunt of some of the worst climate-related disasters that we've ever seen. I mean, people have lost their homes and their livelihoods, and to them, the climate crisis is very real and very present and not some long-away threat. In fact, the Philippines is the most vulnerable country to hazards brought about by climate change. while the people here aren't even large contributors to global CO2 emissions, just like what Sunishima and Tish had said. And as a result of this, I launched my social venture, the Cacao Project, to help equip local communities and farmers with the resources they need to cultivate resilient and climate smart and regenerative livelihoods so that they would be better positioned for sustainable success. But the journey does not end there. We need to have better policies and long-term plans and public processes that address the very real and very urgent human faces of the climate crisis, the ones that don't treat them as numbers and statistics, but as people trying to get by day. And I know I speak for myself and I speak for my community, and I guess also as the very women of this panel, that we are faces of these climate crisis emergencies, and we stand here today to represent those people, but also we are one of them.
Thank you, Louise. Tashiko, please.
Thank you, Kavita. I echo both what Sunishma and Louise have already said. As a proud Torres Strait Islander, my people come from the islands, and we suffer from the same monsoonal season that Pacific and Asian communities are affected deeply as well. And I mean, what really can I say that you haven't already said? I think it comes down to right now, it's still monsoonal season here in Australia, and food security is a massive issue. It's too rough to go hunting out on the waters because my people depend highly on natural resources. And so, with rough seas, that's a loss of, their food supply, but it's also a loss of, connection to our country, our culture, right? And so it's not only affecting us physically, but mentally and emotionally. I think really importantly, I just recently spent some time to reconnect, learning my old stories, and we had a king tide come through, and it took away one of my old people's grave burial sites. And I had to, go through this ceremony that my family have never gone through before, but to pick up the pieces of my ancestors' bones. And that's what's real. Like, my people are drowning, even in the afterlife. And I think that's what's really confronting. And so I think, being able to, use my experience and be able to work in this space that, that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and be able to have these critical conversations with all of you is just really empowering and inspiring. And so I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Tish. That was a really moving example of, how the loss of cultural rights is also such a huge challenge in the face of, the crisis that we're facing. So thank you for sharing that. And I'd like Emily to share about your experience next. Thanks.
Thanks, Kavita. And yeah, we work with LGBTIQ or diverse OGS communities around Asia and the Pacific on looking at their experiences, their lived experience of disasters, humanitarian contexts, and what the humanitarian and development systems are doing. I think it's really important to recognise that the stories are really different. So the stories of lesbian women and gay men are often going to be really different. So people think LGBTIQ might be one thing, or there's a solution, or it's all kinds of different problems and solutions, and that vary hugely across the region that we're talking about. I think it's often really hard for people with diverse OGS to establish resilient lives. There's discrimination in families, in faith communities, local communities, schools, workplaces, accessing public services, in public life, walking down the street. And that discrimination doesn't stop just because there's a climate-related, weather-related disaster. People ask themselves questions about, so why, should I go to this evacuation centre? I experience violence in my everyday life. Am I going to experience violence when I go there? Quite possibly, yes. Well, then I need to go somewhere else. And so people might stay in a house which has had half their roof blown off, or they might seek shelter with someone else from an LGBTIQ or diverse OGS community and rely upon those kinds of community resources. And often the humanitarian agency is responding to in these climate-related natural disasters haven't done their thinking about how to address that. I think something else that we've seen in Fiji and many other places also is the blaming of LGBTIQ people for bringing disasters. So I think that it's understandable that these are tough times. There's more risk, there's more uncertainty, and so people are sometimes trying to work out, well, why is this happening? And when they do that, sometimes they look for simple answers, and sometimes the simple thing is to blame a marginalised group. So sometimes we're blamed because a cyclone is divine punishment for our supposed sins. And so I think there's work that needs to be done there, for example, in thinking about the kinds of narratives that get perpetuated. So all kinds of different experiences.
Thank you, Emily. Again, it's quite eye-opening to realize just the lack of awareness and information on diversity and how, whether it's environment degradation, disasters, or the climate impacts, have such different impacts, even within the diversity of the LGBTI community. And I think that's something that all of us should take on board in terms of the work that we're doing, because I think we tend to just group, the diversity in just language and then assume that the same solutions or the same processes just equally applicable to all. And that's why I think, Abia, it's really good for you to go next to then explain, like how do persons living with disabilities, are impacted by these challenges.
Yeah, thank you so much. When we talk about the disasters and the climate change, we have witnessed, like in the Asia Pacific region and specifically in Pakistan, lots of earthquakes and disasters. And we have seen like parents take their expensive things and leave their persons with disabilities behind because they thought like they are going to support us, but not persons with disabilities, because it's a carry on the burden and all. And that's the time when they face gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and the people who came to protect them, they are the one who's doing all the discrimination. And then we really need the systematic changes, systematically how we can bring that change. What we did on the first step, we have talked with the cluster mechanism, like the system was established, and we established aging and disability task force. So at least people with disabilities can sit with the UN, with the government, with all the stakeholders to talk about their challenges, to talk about their rights. At the same time, we also did, like in the Asia Pacific region, we conducted the consultations with the organizations of persons with disability and reviewed the eyesight guidelines, because we have seen like there were so many gaps from the gender perspective, from the disability perspective. So how we can bring that first-hand experiences of persons with disability, so at least they can talk about it. And again, same for the COVID response, when we find out like persons with disabilities were having a lot of psychosocial problems and the trauma, and like we always said like they are staying always at home, but the so-called non-disabled people also staying same back at the home during the COVID pandemic. So it created a lot of challenges for them. They were not able to move around, not going to get the assistance from the personal assistants to go to the toilet, to use washrooms and all that. So we did that, established the virtual mechanisms for the peer support, peer counseling to women and girls with disability, so they can realize like how we can get in touch with each other. We build their capacities on using the technology. And again, from the UN system and from the international organizations, and it's very important to translate that information into understandable language, the accessibility we need to provide for them, and how we can engage the direct voices from the grassroots level, so at least they can share the experiences and they can talk about it. On the International Women Day, we also like try to get some of the resilience and women who have done and so much work on the climate change, on the COVID response, and we acknowledge, like try to acknowledge their work and use them as a role model, so at least people can get those examples and share with their communities how we can bring the change. I know it's not possible in one day, but it's like all we can present something and talk with different people, then we can bring that change.
Great, thank you so much, Abia. I think this was a really good example of how intersectional human rights-based approaches is so critical in our planning processes, monitoring and evaluation in inclusive resilience and adaptation. For instance, if we take an example, say there is, we take an individual who is from a low-lying island in the Pacific or even Philippines that are, facing some of the worst impacts of the crises. And then that person has an indigenous identity, and that person could possibly be gender non-binary and suffer from a physical disability. If you put all of these different intersectionalities into an individual, you can then assume that for this individual, the impacts are so much more challenging. So how do we actually get these voices into these spaces to make sure we are actually using an intersectional and inclusive human rights-based approach in the work that we're trying to do? So thank you so much. So what we're going to do next is we're going to open the floor to the attendees to please, if you have any questions, to direct it to our panelists and also to Mr. Saad and Ms. Camille Pross, if you had questions for them. So we'll just open the floor, and please feel free to introduce yourself and turn on your cameras so that we can get to know you as well. At the moment, if there's questions in the chat box. Okay, we do have one question. The question is, when climate change becomes a political topic and creates a political sphere, often LGBTIQ+ becomes excluded based on political agenda. This is for Emily. Do you have any reflection or activities you do to shake the political sphere for climate change to have LGBTIQ+ voices?
Unmute myself, and yes, so starting with the easy question. I think in each of the countries, any country in the region, there are civil society organisations, there are informal networks that are already working on these issues politically, that have a sense of the local politics and what is and isn't possible. So often this is one of those many situations where working through local organisations is a good thing to do. I mean, there are also global mechanisms. For example, there is now an independent expert as part of the human rights system who does reports on the extent to which states are or are not respecting the human rights of people with diverse SOGIESC. I think even as we take are committed to a human rights approach, we understand that tactically, sometimes coming in with strong human rights language is not always the way to build bridges and to have conversations. So there's one project that we're actually part of at the moment in Fiji as part of the Australian Pacific Climate Partnership, which is working with faith leaders, working with diverse SOGIESC or LGBTIQ people, and working with climate change, climate scientists and knowledge brokers, using a participatory action research model to explore why it is that particular kinds of narratives become sort of apparent in Fiji, for example, when there is a cyclone. So the idea that cyclones have eyes and they're sort of targeting people. So really, it's about sort of finding ways to start those conversations. And something that I think is also really important to acknowledge and recognise is that LGBTIQ inclusion, LGBTIQ lives is not some kind of global north imposition on other countries. Diversity of gender and sexuality and bodies is part of every country. Many countries in Asia and the Pacific have long histories of this diversity. Often it was the colonial experience that led to the criminalisation or the introduction of religion and political trends that lead to discrimination that we see today. It's really complicated. We tend to work more from the bottom up. And trying to start conversations rather than inserting ourselves into the political process. But I guess it's like so many problems, it's one that needs to be addressed from many different perspectives at the same time.
Thank you, Emily. So I have another question. One of the key barriers preventing gender equality is discriminatory social norms and stereotyping, diminishing the roles of women. Do you have any views on how these norms could be changed?
Yeah.
Abia, would you like to go?
Thank you. In fact, the discrimination on the basis of the stereotypes and just perception about the diversified groups of women, it's so in depth in our societies. Like we have to address it properly with the engagement and the leadership of women at all like phases. It's not only the beneficiaries or engaging them on the policy level or reserving some seats or the quota. It's all about like engaging at all levels. And we also say like it's a twin track approach which we need to adopt. On one hand, we have to sensitize and empower women and girls with disabilities so they can take the leadership role and do the advocacy. And at the same time, development organizations, the systems, the government representatives, the state, everyone need to understand and give, like having that space for women to talk about it. And then we can change through like continuous dialogues, visibility of the woman at all levels. And we could say like it's a seat on the table. We remember like in some of the meetings we were going, and they said 10 women, 10 men, and 10 disabled people are here. So we were like, we can also be women or men, or you can call us LGBTI. Like how you can define us, it's very important. We have a identity and we are very proud of it. Like how you're acknowledging that. If you're not acknowledging the rights of person with, we are saying them special people, differently able, then all these terminologies are set for us. But where is our identity? Like we as women with disabilities are like feel okay with that. So how we can accept that? So accepting the diversity through the legislation, through removing the barriers, through advocacy, and at the same time like opening space for everyone, so then we can make that visibility.
Thank you, Abia. If any of the other panelists would also like to share your views on how we can challenge the stereotypes and discrimination around gender equality.
I was thinking, just sort of like reflecting on what everyone's been saying, is just normalizing everything, putting it in every day. Like, we're seeing a massive shift, and I think we need to really be leading in that space. And I think what Abia was just saying, like, we have an identity and, we are proud of it, is something that it shouldn't have to be, we have an identity. It should be something everyone normalizes, like, I know who that is, and I love that they are proud of it, And so I think by, adapting, changing the language, sort of what everyone's saying that suits, each specific, space or person, I think that just helps as well. And that's something that, I'm trying to do and implement in, the organization that I work for. And it's really great that it's, it allows a safe space for that diverse open. And I think, lots of cultural shifts just need a change in these spaces. And we need more people to, stand with us and elevate their voices.
Challenge the patriarchy, absolutely. Thank you, Tish. The third question is, why is development and gender studies so blind on the lives and experiences of LGBTIQ+ people? In other words, why is development so heteronormative?
How much time have you got?
Enough, Emily.
Look, so I mean, I think this comes back to norms, and so the kinds of norms that we see in societies that lead to the exclusion of LGBTIQ people, that you see institutionalized in laws and social practices, are also, you can also find them in the work of humanitarian and development organisations, in the academy, and so forth. So just to take one example, one of the norms I mentioned earlier, heteronormativity, and you just mentioned, Kavita. So an assumption that everyone's heterosexual, and people just sort of make that assumption without thinking about it. It's a norm. So when we think about what constitutes a family or what constitutes a household for the purposes of, say, relief delivery, people are thinking about a family or a household where there is a heterosexual relationship at the core. And so if you have a same-sex couple, two women who are in a relationship and form a family, well, then they're just not part of the thinking. Same with say cis-normativity. You might have, which is the assumption that everyone's gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth, which ignores the existence of transgender people. A lot of transgender people, for example, along with other people within the LGBTIQ community, form chosen families. So we come together in our own family groups because we're excluded from our regular families. Are we a family for the purposes of aid delivery? If there are 7 trans people living in an apartment in Suva, does that count? So these are all assumptions which are built into the very way that we think, our assessment tools, our design tools, the way we do programs. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Louise, I believe we dropped you earlier in this Q&A. I'll just put a question to you so that you've also got a chance to participate. And I think this is a good one as well. Like, what do you think are one of the key barriers preventing gender equality? One of the key barriers preventing gender equality, is discriminating social norms and stereotype, diminishing the roles of women. Do you have any views on how this can be changed?
I mean, definitely. I have a social venture in the agricultural industry, and as a chef as well, I've been in 2 very male-dominated industries. And part of it as well is we've got deeply rooted cultural stigmas. I mean, children here in schools are taught that, they shouldn't have dark skin or they shouldn't be in an agricultural career because then it equates to poverty or failure. And that's very problematic because you're telling children as young as in primary school levels and secondary school levels that, if they are in a farming family or pursue farming careers or have passion for the environment, then they shouldn't pursue it because then they would get dark skin or not earn enough. And that's very problematic. And teachers perpetuate that, unfortunately. But I think that it can easily be fixed in school levels and educational levels. And if they have more role models like young women who are actually pursuing these careers and succeeding despite the barriers and challenges we face, because in reality, women now, we're not going to wait for an equal world. We're going to start acting now. And I think that's very important that more young women feel empowered to do everything despite the challenges and barriers we face, and that we can kind of disassemble all those negative cultural stigmas.
Thank you, Louise. There was a reason I did ask you that question. Sunishma, did you want to go?
Yes, if I could add on to Louise. So when we were young, we were told that technical drawing is for boys. We were not supposed to. The girls are supposed to do home economics, and the girls are not supposed to play soccer with the boys. We're supposed to learn how to do sewing, and yeah, I wasn't allowed to do that, but now I can see slowly my mindset is like totally different from my parents and my grandparents, that like we should have equal rights at home. Both of us, like me and my brother, we both should be doing the house chores, washing dishes, watching whenever it's TV time, both of us can watch. So it's slowly changing in my house. In the communities, I see some of the communities, they still follow those kind of norms. So, but some of them, they're really getting modern, I'd say. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunishma. I think I can totally relate, especially for those of us coming from quite patriarchal and conservative communities. And so I do play soccer as well now. So there is a way we can challenge this bit by bit. So thank you, everyone. So we'll close the Q&A for now, and I'll turn again to our third and last question to our panelists. And so the third question is, what recommendations do you have to enable or improve rights-based planning in inclusive resilience? So Tish, we'll start with you.
Thank you. You know, I really sort of like echoing a lot what everyone's been saying, but I think it's like, you know, there needs to be significant change at, you know, within the, you know, for here, especially within Australia, like governments at, you know, all levels, local, state and federal, really need to listen to our community and our people. You know, we are the only country in the world that doesn't have a treaty with their Indigenous people. It is frightening as a, you know, as a First Nation person living in this country, thinking about that, because especially as a proud Torres Strait Islander, you know, I'm a minority within a minority, and spaces like, you know, the climate community in which I work in, they've fallen short of understanding our culture and environmental issues impacting our homes. And I'm sure a lot that live in, you know, low-lying communities can resonate that these issues aren't anything new. We've been fighting these same issues for decades and decades, or, you know, some can say since colonization. But, you know, there is compelling evidence that increasing, you know, social inequality is, you know, linked to environmental degradation, and the health of First Nations people, Indigenous people, people of color, and those living in poverty, marginalized, are negatively impacted by exposed to higher levels of these environmental pollutions and pollutants, you know, whilst not contributing, like we've all sort of said. And it is no secret that, you know, not everyone has the same responsibility for global warming, but when we look at the causes of the global climate crisis, many of them can be attributed to the richest countries. And I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that climate change has been a deeper symptom of these deeper injustices. And if Australia, you know, really embraced and educated themselves about the true history of this country by understanding culture and our traditional practices, you know, and allowing for this to happen will be a big step towards, you know, our human rights. And I think that goes on to a good segue into like what we really need to really improve in this space. And I think it's just understanding and acknowledge that we still have a racial discrimination in this country, and a human rights-based approach is prioritizing to people in the most marginalized or vulnerable situations who face these biggest barriers. And the fact of the matter is that Indigenous people are continuing to still die in the hands of the justice system. Indigenous children are continuing to be taken away from our families and communities. Our sacred sites are continuing to be destroyed by corporations like Rio Tinto, and, you know, public money is, you know, being, you know, given to companies like Origin Energy to frack, you know, our country. And so Australian government is not addressing the climate crisis and not making efforts to reduce our carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement and, you know, implementing the SDGs. And so, you know, I think here this is, you know, these are some of the things that, you know, need to still happen in order for significant change. Leave it with you.
Tish, thank you so much. You brought up two very important points. One is historical responsibility and how that really influences all the corporate capture in the spaces where we're trying to really effect some solid implementation around human rights centered approaches. But yes, you're right, they do get undermined when we have got companies sharing the same spaces with us with their own agenda. So, and it also goes into, you know, what Camille was talking about, that a lot of this work actually gets impeded because the root causes are still not being addressed as much as it should. So we're having like a superficial analysis on, you know, inclusive resilience and what it means, but without addressing and tackling the root causes, which goes to Abia's point about, you know, demanding systematic changes for radical transformation. So Abia, your take next on what recommendations do you have to enable or improve rights-based planning for inclusive resilience?
Thank you. I would say that the gap, which as Tisha has already mentioned, like it's very important to see and do some of the research work which is needed on the country basis, like what are the gaps that exist, and secondly the data and disaggregated data is not available. So how we can make that mechanism so we can get evidence-based data and the research work. And secondly, when we talk from the connections with the different organizations, at the same time, we need to think about the long-term plans with the formal allocations of the budget, because most of the organizations, they do their like planning, but they forgot the part for how they are going to do it and which are the key stakeholders they are engaging. Thirdly, I would say allocation of the budget with and same like having more representations of persons or different, like who are the experiencing the discrimination on the table, so they can talk more about their own experiences and how they are going to bring that change. Fourthly, I would recommend, like most of the UN and international organizations and the countries who are working on the country level, they also need to collectively bring some of the guidelines or the checklists and some tools for the inclusion and the resilient society on the regional and the country level. So at least when we talk with different organizations, they are aware, like people are excluded, but they don't know how to do it. So if we propose the people who are at the ground, they can work together and to prepare these guidelines, that would be very helpful. And fourthly, on the country levels, like the National Disaster Management Authorities or the UNEP country offices, how they are working closely with each other for the policy reforms. But because once the policies are in place, then it will be easier to do the implementation and people can get more attention on that. So we can use the regional platforms such as the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, how we are moving with the regional like Beijing 25 review platform, where we can talk about this issue and the climate change, which is really important, and we are bringing that concerns into the highlights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abia. Some excellent points and really well-detailed recommendations on what human rights planning should look like. And I think you raised a really important point, is the lack of disaggregated data. I think that's a huge challenge, particularly on vulnerable groups, in informing the budgeting and resources and the plans. So it would be really good if, you know, if the rest of the panelists could also share some ways or ideas or innovative approaches on some of the, you know, gaps and challenges that you've identified. Emily, would you please like to go next?
Thanks, Kavita. Okay, so 5 quick points. Firstly, do some reading. So there's the report that we're putting out with UN Women Empower, and thank you to CEDA, called The Only Way Is Up. But there are other works out there. There was a big conference in Bangkok about 2 years ago called Pride in the Humanitarian System. The Stockholm Environment Institute has another project looking at gender diversity and non-binary people in Asia and the Pacific. So there are materials out there that you can read and engage with. The second thing, and a related point, is get trained. Build your own capacity, ask for training within your organisation. Most humanitarian development organisations don't have policy and practice. They don't provide training for their staff. And I think by not having that kind of stuff in place, it means that people's concerns about doing no harm sort of get amplified, because they, oh, we can't do this because we might cause harm. Well, that's a legitimate concern, but you know, we mitigate risk all the time, and we do that by building our own capacity. We also do it by building strong connections with local LGBTIQ organisations. So that's the third point. There are great local, national, subnational organisations working in lots of different countries, doing lots of great work at a local level. I think a lot of the really interesting DRR and climate justice work does happen at very, very local levels, maybe where some of the national level politics is a little bit sort of less hot, if you like. And absolutely agree with Avia that you must fund them. You can't just invite them to things and not fund them. It happens always to lots of people will be nodding, but there has to be funding involved for the inclusion to be genuine. Do assessments of your programs. Think about, you know, what assumptions are we making that might be excluding people unintentionally, and there are tools around for doing that. It's not enough just to add LGBTIQ people in STIR, in the same way that it was never enough to add women in STIR. It's not enough to add any of us on this panel and STIR. is actually a process of reflection and change in organisations. Finally, on the data point, yeah, LGBTIQ people, like other people, are often not part of assessments. We're not part of data. There's often a fascination with numbers. We're often asked this: how many LGBTIQ people are there? There are lots. That's all you need to know. Is it 5%? Is it 8%? Is it? Does it matter? We exist everywhere. And so it's not about the number, it's about the lived experience. It's about understanding that and designing programs that all people can participate in, whether they feel able to identify themselves or not. And it's often qualitative methods or participatory methods that put those people with that lived experience at the heart of research and decision making, which are the best ways forward.
Great 5 points, Emily. Really great. Thank you. Sunishma.
Sure, thank you, Kavita. So from my experience, many youths in the Pacific, I'd say, and also from my settlement and my majority of my friends, they do not even know their rights and what they're capable of, what they need to do. So we need to improve our communication and do more outreach in communities. Maybe the first year students in USP, high school students, especially, and also the interior villages in the Pacific. I have only 2 points, sorry. And the second one is disasters do not impact all the people in the same way. But we must know how each vulnerable group, such as older people, people with disabilities, marginalized group, and women are affected. Promote bottom-up collaboration, integrating Native and other marginalized communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Sunishma. Yes, extremely important points that you've raised there as well. And finally, Louise.
Thank you, Kavita. Echoing Avia and everyone else on this panel, I think we need to make these types of dialogues more open to the very people who are under discussion, to the people who, well, so to speak, stare down the barrel of the gun and look at the climate crisis in the eye in their day-to-day lives and livelihoods. And we also need to open it to youth and women and vulnerable groups whose futures depend on our actions and these types of discussions. And it shouldn't be just tokenistic or just involving us for the sake of ticking boxes of, yes, there's a woman, or yes, there's a youth here, and then that's it. We need to recognize that young people and women all have meaningful things to offer. And a recommendation is that, if we want to kind of integrate adaptation and looking forward to the future and transforming a better world, we also need to reach back to our roots and to the knowledge and wisdom of our elders too, who lived in a time when farming was just farming and food was just food, and had their own cultures and traditions that worked in with nature and allow us to live in harmony with our environment long before we had managed to cause a systems collapse to our biosphere. And I believe that Native and indigent and rural communities have their own kind of wisdom to offer. In the Philippines, we call this kind of a spirit of bayanihan, where we have a spirit of mutual respect and reverting back to what truly matters most. And in a time where we have so many pragmatic and bleak realizations in science, we also need to reach back and acknowledge some things that science can't quite explain, and more importantly, appeal to our humanity. So we also, another point that I think I wanted to bring up is bringing out a better system of accountability and impact measurement at the planning level. We need to determine the parameters we'll measure these plans to, that yes, people will commit, but are they going to actually implement it in a way that's meaningful, in a way that matters to our communities, and ensure that it's closely monitored. And we may need to make sure as well that, as Camille said in her presentation, that the communities are agents of change, that they're all of us here as well are equally gatekeepers to a future that we're working to build. And to do so, we need to break down those walls that separate us and begin to do this good work together as stewards of our future, of our environment, and to creation.
Thank you, Louise. That was the one point that I was trying to tweak out as well. And thank you so much for bringing it. The centrality of using Indigenous knowledge and resource management, traditional knowledge that has existed for time immemorial, and probably one of the only ways in which we can truly understand resilience is by using this knowledge. So thank you so much for raising that. I was just going to ask Mr. Saad if he had any reaction or comments or feedbacks to the panel, because I understand this is kind of sort of the recommendations and the innovative approaches and some of the key strategies that the panelists have talked about. So please, Mr. Saad.
Thank you for giving me the floor at this hour. I think, it was one of the most beneficial occasions for me since I became a special rapporteur, really, without paying any compliment, I benefited from all of you, all the panelists, and you as a moderator. Sometimes the moderator is more important than the speaker, because the moderator has, the skill how to mine for the good ideas and the real answer for the questions. The title itself is very challenging because you are talking about, human rights-based inclusive resilience. Because if we really want to survive, we have to build up an inclusive resilience. Without it, either we go back or we demolish. So it is, it's the vital human action if we want to survive before talk about any progress or regression even. Here, this our, stone where we stand on to look for the future. Also, I would like to say, all of the questions raised are relevant. We are living it. But what we do from here, this is the question. I think we have to face, in all honesty, ourselves, where we belong to and what we are doing. Are we really following faithfully the human rights-based approach, or we are trying to make it some sort of political announcements or some sort of domestic political game? First of all, I'm not that idealistic. I'm very realistic, but still, I think we have to tame ourselves to believe in the application of the human rights principles. We have to remember that we have enough of international instruments. We have enough of rules. The international humanitarian law is developing every single second. We are not lacking one of these, but we have to show our will to go a little bit further. Among the issues which were raised, I like very much when we are talking about data, because data is really the key for any understanding and for any solution. And if we really want to have resilience, unless we have this kind of disaggregated data on all topics and aspects mentioned today, we will not really know where we are and where to go. This one element. The other one, we need more information and more awareness, because sometimes we are talking about principles without going deeply into the details and how to make it a factor impacting our behavior. I'm not trying to be a behavioralist here, but I'm trying to tame the shrew, as they say. If we want to have this here, unless we do some principles and well-known and advocating a lot every time, don't get fed up from advocating. Be an advocate day and night with all circles you are moving in. Otherwise, somebody will slip here or there. So here again, advocacy is a very important subject. The right to development, not because I am the one in charge of this rapporteurship, but the right to develop must be seen in the right perspective. For me, all rights are equal, but some are more equal than others. Because the right to development could be some sort of an elevator, something of a lift up for other rights. And if you go through all the good speech and ideas expressed by the panelists today, the bottom line, again, takes me back to the right to development. So here, the right to development needs to be more enlightened. I have in my mandate that I have to take the 2030 agenda I have to take Addis Ababa Declaration, take, the resilience and Sendai. I have to take also the climate change Paris. These 4 pillars together compose my main subject. But still, I need something of a more comprehensive or some sort which will be an umbrella for all this. And the umbrella will come from you. And from you, I mean from women. I always believe that women, despite all the victimization, despite all the bad treatment they are suffering here and there, they are still influential enough to recover from this and to lead us for a more resilient world. They have a role. We are all aware, and we are sympathizing with their injustice feelings. But still, despite this, while they have to fight against this kind of injustice, they have to fight also to make progress for the humanity, because they are very influential, but they don't recognize it sometimes. It's everything in life, a woman. It is the mother, it's the sister, it's the wife, it's the leader, it's the thinker. And I was really pleased to read a lecture 2 days ago given by an Indian scholar, which has one of the eminent jobs at the IMF. She was talking about, that at the IMF now, the gender is reaching the percentage of 30% in the leading post. This is a result of what? Of the continuous struggle and continuous fight for women and for gender balance. So sometimes you are doomed to do it, whether you like it or not, but at least women will be something here. So I really feel very grateful to all speakers today, all comments or ideas. I'm taking home many of them, and I'll be more than delighted if you send me something written, not in a formal letter, but just, a paper, a working paper, where I can consider it as some sort of a menu for my work in the future. And also, I would like to remind you, I'm working this year on the report on climate change. And because of the pandemic and the difficulties I'm facing in communication, up till now, I have very few input. So you can help me and play a vital role in this help. And thank you again, and please keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saad. I think you've summarized the entire panel in a very powerful way. And so I'll just take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists. And for the audience, we do have a very intersectional audience here, but do remember, the intersectionality extends in the human rights space quite broadly. There's migrant workers, refugees, there's people living under occupation, many vulnerable and marginalized groups that we need to take into account when we're talking about inclusive human rights-based approaches. So on behalf of the entire team that has organized this, thank you so much. The UN organizations, our 2 speakers, the panelists, and to our great audience for really joining us for this session. We will now close this session, and I wish you all the very best in the other sessions that you attend today and tomorrow. Good luck and goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the key messages of day 2, and then immediately after, we will be having a trivia night. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubilo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN 2020. Thank you once again for the participation and see you in the next sessions.